My shift ended an hour ago, but I was still sitting at my desk, finishing reports for an upcoming project. The office was nearly empty, with only the distant hum of the cleaning crew vacuuming the hallway and the occasional flicker of the overhead lights. That was when I heard my boss's voice. Charles spoke for the second time. Mr. Carlson rarely addressed me directly unless it was work-related. He was a serious man, always composed, always in control. I quickly stood up, adjusted my tie, and walked toward his office. "Sir?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment before speaking. "My driver has a scheduling issue. I need someone to take my daughter home." I thought I had misheard. "Your daughter?" "Yes. Regina. She's downstairs waiting in the lobby." I had never met his daughter before. Of course, I had heard of her, Regina Carlson, 19 years old, young, beautiful, known for being independent and somewhat unpredictable. A few guys in the office had casually mentioned her with a tone of admiration, but I never expected to be personally involved in anything concerning her. "Of course, sir. I'd be happy to." He nodded in approval, as if he expected nothing less from me. "Good. Be professional. Drive safely." With that, the conversation ended. I grabbed my coat and headed for the lobby. As I stepped out of the elevator, I spotted her immediately. Regina Carlson didn't look like someone who needed a ride home. She was leaning against the reception desk, scrolling through her phone, her posture relaxed and effortlessly comfortable. Her long, dark brown hair framed a flawless face, and she wore a fitted leather jacket over a simple yet stylish dress. She glanced up as I approached, raising an eyebrow. "You must be my ride," she said, a smirk playing on her lips. Her tone had a teasing edge, as if she found the whole situation amusing. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep it professional. "Your father asked me to take you home." She slipped her phone into her purse and straightened up. "Huh. That's a surprise." "For me too." I led her to my car and held the door open. She slid in effortlessly, and I walked around to the driver's seat, adjusting my tie before starting the engine. "Nice car," she noted, running her fingers over the dashboard. "Did my father buy it for you?" I chuckled. "No, I bought it myself." She glanced at me, her expression shifting slightly, as if reassessing me. "Interesting." The first few minutes of the drive were quiet. The city lights blurred past us as we merged onto the highway. I focused on the road, but I could feel her gaze on me from the passenger seat. Eventually, she broke the silence. "Do you always drive your boss's daughter home, or is this a special assignment?" I smirked for the first time. She tilted her head. "Luckily for me, this is a first." There was something about the way she spoke that made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. I reminded myself to stay focused. This was just a simple drive home. Nothing more. But somehow, it didn't feel that way. The city lights flickered as we drove in silence. I kept my hands firmly on the wheel, but I was acutely aware of Regina sitting beside me. She shifted slightly, crossing one leg over the other. The leather of her jacket creaked as she leaned back in her seat. Then she suddenly spoke, her voice casual but curious. "How long have you worked for my father?" 2 years, I answered, still looking at the road. 2 years, she repeated, letting the words hang in the air before glancing at me. "And do you like it?" I hesitated for a second. That wasn't a question I was used to answering honestly. "It's a good job," I said finally. "It pays well." She scoffed. "That's not what I asked." I exhaled through my nose, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "It's demanding, but I knew what I was signing up for." Regina studied me for a moment, as if trying to read between the lines. "Yeah," she murmured. "You sound like my father." I glanced at her briefly. Her expression had shifted, less playful, more pensive. I didn't know much about her relationship with her father, but from the way she spoke, it didn't sound particularly warm. A red light forced us to stop. She turned slightly toward me, resting her elbow against the car door. You're different, she said. I frowned. Different? She shrugged, tilting her head. I don't know. Most guys who work for my father act like robots. Yes, sir, right away, sir. She paused, a glimmer of mischief in her eyes. You actually seem real. I laughed. Thanks, I guess. She smiled, but before she could say anything else, the car behind us honked. The light had turned green. I cleared my throat and started driving again, my mind racing with her words. Was I different? I had never thought about it before. We turned off the highway into a quieter neighborhood. Large houses with gated driveways lined the streets, their windows glowing warmly against the dark sky. Regina sighed, stretching slightly. Almost there, she mumbled. She didn't sound particularly happy about it. I glanced at her. You don't like going home? She let out a dry laugh. Home? That's not home. It's just where I sleep. There was something in her voice, something deeper, a kind of loneliness. I didn't press. Instead, I just nodded. Yeah. I get that. She turned to me, her eyes searching mine for a moment. It felt like we understood something about each other that neither of us had to say out loud. The GPS announced our arrival, breaking the silence. I pulled up to a large iron gate and eased the car to a stop. We're here, I said. Regina didn't move immediately. She looked at the house, then back at me, hesitating. Then, to my surprise, she smiled, a soft, almost shy smile. Thanks for the ride, Charles. It was the first time she had said my name. As if it meant something. Before I could respond, she opened the door and stepped out. And just like that, she was gone. I watched as the gate slowly opened and she disappeared down the long driveway, the glow of the porch lights swallowing her silhouette. I didn't know why, but something about tonight felt different, like something had started, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. I woke up the next morning still thinking about the drive. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way Regina had looked at me before she left, like she had more to say but held back. Or maybe it was what she had said, that I seemed different. It stuck with me. I arrived at work early, as usual. The office was already bustling, employees moving between meetings, coffee cups in hand. I sat at my desk, pushing thoughts of last night aside. But just as I opened my laptop, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Regina. I stared at the screen. How did she get my number? Before I could process it, another message popped up. Thanks for the ride last night. Hope I didn't keep you out too late. I hesitated, then replied. No problem. Anytime. I kept it short, but a minute later, another message appeared. Regina, so, do you always work this much? I frowned. That wasn't just small talk. She was asking something more. I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Before I could overthink it, I typed back. I do. Why? A moment passed. Then, Regina. Just wondering what you do when you're not working. I smirked. She was definitely flirting. I kept a calm expression. She was still young and stubborn. He let out a sharp exhale. But she was my only child, and I needed her to understand how the world worked. I nodded slowly, unsure of where this would lead. I need someone I can trust to be around her. He studied me for a second. You're reliable, Charles. I see that. I tensed slightly. I want you to keep an eye on her, he continued. Make sure she doesn't do anything reckless. If she reaches out, let me know. My stomach tightened. Yes, sir. He gave me a stern look before turning back to his paperwork, dismissing me without another word. I walked out of his office with a restless feeling. Keep an eye on her. Let him know if she reaches out. I pulled out my phone. Regina had sent another message while I was inside. Regina, wanna grab coffee later? I stared at the screen. Mr. Carlson's words still echoed in my mind. I knew what the right thing to do was. But for some reason, I typed back. Me, what time? I hesitated before hitting send. Mr. Carlson had made it clear, if Regina reached out, I had to tell him. But something about that didn't sit right with me. She wasn't a child. She was 19. And while I understood her father's concerns, I wasn't about to spy on her. I still agreed to meet her. It felt like stepping into something I shouldn't. A few seconds later, she replied. Regina, let's meet at Grace's Cafe at 6. Grace's was a small cafe a few blocks from the office, not too fancy, not too crowded. I took a deep breath and typed back. Me, see you then. The day dragged on, meetings, emails, phone calls. I went through the motions, but my mind wasn't entirely there. Around 5:45, I left the office, telling myself it was just coffee. Nothing more. When I stepped into Grace's, Regina was already there, sitting by the window with a cappuccino in front of her. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. Wow, she said, tilting her head. Didn't think you'd actually show. I smiled. Why ask if you didn't think I would? She shrugged. I don't know. Figured you might be too busy being the perfect employee. I sat across from her. I do other things, you know. Oh yeah? She leaned forward. Like what? I opened my mouth to respond, but what could I say? Work took up most of my time. She smirked. Exactly what I thought. The barista came over, and I ordered a black coffee. Regina watched me, studying me like she was trying to figure something out. Why are you really here, Charles? She asked after a moment. I frowned. You invited me. Yeah, but you hesitated before replying. She took a sip of her cappuccino. And you don't seem like the type to just grab coffee with the boss's daughter. She wasn't wrong. I exhaled. Your father asked me to keep an eye on you. Her expression shifted, not surprised, but disappointed. Of course, he did, she muttered, leaning back. Did he tell you to report back if I texted you? I didn't answer. That's a yes, she scoffed. Wow. So what are you gonna tell him? That we're sitting here right now? No. I shook my head. I didn't even tell him you texted me. That surprised her. She studied me again, her expression softer this time. Why not? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Because you're not a child. And because I don't think it's my place to monitor you. She just smiled, just a little. You know, she said, stirring the foam in her cup, you're different. I raised an eyebrow. You keep saying that. Because it's true. She propped her chin on her hand. Every guy I know either wants something from me or is too scared of my father to even talk to me. I didn't know what to say to that. Before I could come up with a response, she leaned in slightly. And for some reason, that sent a strange feeling through me. I cleared my throat, trying to shake it off. I'm not that complicated. She smiled. We'll see. Her confidence was striking, like she knew something I didn't. We talked for a while. About work. About her classes. About life. It was easy. Natural. And before I knew it, 2 hours had passed. She glanced at her phone. I should probably head home. I nodded. I'll walk you out. We stepped onto the sidewalk, the evening air cool against my skin. Regina turned to me. You know, she said, my driver isn't picking me up today. I raised an eyebrow. She grinned. Guess I need a ride. I exhaled, shaking my head. You planned this, didn't you? She laughed. Maybe. I unlocked my car, and as she slid into the passenger seat, I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping in. This was more than just coffee. And I wasn't sure I was ready for where it was going. As I pulled onto the main road, Regina shifted in her seat, tucking her hair behind her ear. So, am I getting the silent treatment now? I glanced at her. She smirked. You've barely said a word since we got in the car. I sighed. She wasn't wrong. My mind had been racing. 2 hours ago, I was just an employee picking up the boss's daughter. Now, I was driving her home after coffee, feeling like this was something else entirely. And the worst part? I liked it. I was just thinking, I finally said. Regina raised an eyebrow. Thinking about what? I hesitated. Then, against my better judgment, I told her the truth. Your father will fire me if he finds out we're doing this. She laughed softly. Wow. Romance really isn't your thing, huh? I looked at her. I'm serious, Regina. So am I. She shifted in her seat. You act like we just committed a crime. Because to your father, we might as well have. She sighed, looking out the window. I hate this, she muttered. Hate all of it. Being treated like a kid when I'm not. Being watched. And I definitely hate feeling like I need permission just to talk to someone. She turned back to me. Someone I like. That part made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. Someone I like. I knew I shouldn't ask. I knew I should let it go. But I couldn't. You like talking to me? She exhaled, almost like she was disappointed I even had to ask. Yes, Charles, she said, her voice softer. I nodded. Silence filled the car again. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It just was. I cleared my throat. It's just, your father isn't someone you want to cross. She looked at me for a long moment. Then we don't tell him. I frowned. Regina, I'm serious. She shifted closer. No one has to know. We're not breaking any laws, Charles. We're just keeping something to ourselves. It felt dangerous. But it also made sense. I sighed, gripping the wheel a little tighter. If he finds out. He won't. I looked at her. She was confident. But there was something else in her expression, too. Hope. She wanted this. And the truth was, so did I. I rolled down the window. Regina. She had turned back halfway to the front door. Yes? I hesitated. What are you doing, Charles? But it was too late to back out now. Tomorrow, I said. She smiled slowly, her lips curving. Why? Are you planning something? I should have said no. I should have reminded her that this was already a bad idea. But instead, I just shrugged. Maybe. Her smile widened. Then I guess I'm free. She gave me one last look before stepping inside, and finally, I forced myself to drive away. The next evening, I found myself parked a few blocks from her house. My fingers tapped against the steering wheel as I waited. This wasn't a date. It couldn't be. And yet my heart pounded as if it was. A few minutes later, Regina slid into the passenger seat, wearing a simple black dress and sneakers, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. No security tailing you? I asked, half joking. She smiled. I'm not a prisoner, Charles. I raised an eyebrow. Okay, she admitted, I told them I was going to a friend's house. I shook my head, trying to hide my smile. You're really good at sneaking around. She leaned back, looking at me with amused curiosity. And you? How good are you at keeping secrets? I didn't answer. I just started driving. We ended up at a quiet waterfront, a small hidden pier I often visited when I needed to clear my head. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful. A place where the rest of the world felt far away. Regina stepped out of the car, hugging her arms as the night breeze blew in. It's nice, she said softly. I leaned against the hood. I come here when I need to think. She glanced at me. And what are you thinking about now? I hesitated. Everything. Nothing. Instead of replying, she reached into the back seat and pulled out a small paper bag. She looked at me curiously. What's this? Food, I said, pulling out a burger and tossing it to her. She laughed, catching it. Seriously? I shrugged. Figured you liked expensive sushi. She smiled. This is perfect. We ate in comfortable silence, the gentle waves lapping against the shore. And then, after a while, Regina spoke. Do you really think this is wrong? I looked at her. What do you mean? She turned slightly toward me. Us. Talking. Spending time together. I sighed. Not wrong. Just, complicated. She studied me for a long moment, then, with quiet confidence, she said, I don't think it's complicated at all. And before I could react, she stepped closer. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the car beside me. Her eyes locked onto mine. The space between us was almost non-existent now. Just a few inches. Tell me to stop, she whispered. I should have. I should have reminded her that her father was my boss. That I had too much to lose. That this wasn't smart. But when I opened my mouth, no words came out, because I didn't want her to stop. And then, just like that, she leaned in. And this time, it wasn't just a quick kiss on the cheek. This was real. Intentional. Her lips brushed against mine, at first, as if giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I kissed her back. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. I knew it was over the second I walked into the office the next morning. The air felt different. People glanced at me, then quickly looked away. Some whispered. Their eyes held something between curiosity and pity. And then my phone rang. Mr. Carlson's office. I didn't hesitate. He knew. The moment I walked in, the door slammed shut behind me. Mr. Carlson stood by the window, his back to me, hands clasped behind him. His office was usually a quiet space. Power felt suffocating here. Sit. I sat. For a long time, he said nothing, just stared out at the skyline, his breath slow and controlled. Then, without turning around, he spoke. How long? I swallowed hard. A few weeks. His jaw tightened. Finally, he faced me, his expression unreadable. She's 19, Charles. I know. She's my daughter. I know that too. His eyes darkened. And yet you thought this was acceptable? I exhaled slowly. I didn't plan for this to happen. That's not an answer. I met his gaze. I love her. Silence. Heavy. Tense. Finally, Mr. Carlson straightened. You have two choices, he said, his voice quieter now, almost tired. End it. Or walk out of here unemployed. I already knew my answer. I stood. I guess this is my last day at work. When I cleared out my desk, Regina was waiting for me outside the building. She knew. Of course, she knew. The moment she saw me, she ran forward, gripping my hands. You quit? I nodded. Your father gave me a choice. She searched my face for regret, hesitation, anything that might make me reconsider. She found nothing. Regina sighed. Then smiled. All right. No second thoughts. No doubts. Just okay. I squeezed her hand. Let's get out of here. That night, we packed whatever could fit into my car. Clothes. Essentials. Nothing else mattered. Where are we even going? Regina asked as we stood beside my overstuffed car, the city lights flickering behind us. I exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. Somewhere that isn't here. She smiled. Good enough for me. As I pulled onto the road, Regina reached over, lacing her fingers with mine. No regrets. No looking back. just the road ahead. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you just knew, whatever happens next will change everything? That was me. Sitting across from Mr. Carlson. My boss. A man who had trusted me for 2 years. A man whose daughter I had fallen for. I knew he'd find out eventually. Secrets like this never stay buried forever. But when the moment finally came, when he looked me in the eye and told me I had to choose between my job and Regina, not for a second did I hesitate. Because, let's be honest, what is a job compared to love? Compared to her? Maybe some of you are wondering, was it reckless? Was it stupid? Was it worth it? My answer? Absolutely. I had spent years playing it safe. Following the rules. Keeping my head down. And sure, the salary was good. The position was stable. But Regina was different. She made me feel alive. She made me want more. And yeah, walking away wasn't easy. I worked hard for that job. I was damn good at it. But the moment I walked out of that office for the last time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Look, I'm not telling you to quit your job tomorrow. I'm not saying you should throw away stability on a whim. But I am saying this. When you find something real, something that sets your soul on fire, don't let fear hold you back. Because at the end of the day, jobs come and go. But the kind of love that shakes you to your core? That only happens once in a lifetime. And I wasn't about to let it slip away.